We are joined by DG Subesh from Ministry of Electricity. He's going to be taking us through of why did they decide to host this committee meeting and what is he thinking will achieve by gathering today with all the stakeholders. Subesh, welcome to BRICS Africa Channel.
Thank you, Ian.
Please take us through. What were your objectives for hosting this gathering today?
I think when we raised our hands to host well, not raised our hands, but when we were given the honor of hosting G20 last year, we took a very conscious decision that we're going to make it an African agenda, or place an African agenda at the center of the G20. In the work we did in the energy work stream, we were very conscious of that responsibility. And you know that part of what we had produced as a presidency publication was a 10-year Africa Infrastructure Master Plan. We did that because we understand that Agenda 2063, African Union's Agenda 2063, will not gain traction if key fundamentals are not addressed. Two of those fundamentals is energy and transport. The third, of course, is the financing question. And so when the AU Commissioner raised with the Minister in the country to say, can we almost as a continuum of the work that we're doing in the G20, host this AU STC, we were quite happy to do that. Why? Because it now gives us an opportunity to take forward the work we did in the G20 and begin to give it traction, so that we're able to address these questions, the underlying questions of energy insecurity on the continent and the extent to which that is inhibiting industrialization and growth, and the extent to which we're able to address the transport question, freight, logistic movements, as again an enabler to ensure that the industrialization agenda of the continent is given substantive traction, because you can produce goods and services. If you're not able to transport it to demand centers, then you don't really have an economic question. And so I think really, that's fundamentally why we raised our hands, because we do believe that South Africa has not only a responsibility, we have an obligation to the continent to use our endowments, our experiences to also ensure that the rest of the continent is able to unearth and exploit our natural resources, so that we do not continue to be an exporter of material and an importer of polished goods and services into the continent. We want to really turn that equation around. But to do that, energy is a critical enabler. We have to build the energy systems, the generation systems. We have to build the interconnected transmission systems that allows us to use the potential of the continent optimally across the continent. And similarly for freight and logistic movements, if we don't begin to optimize the coordination even within the transport sector, rail, road, ports, freight, air freight, we're going to continue to be inefficient as a continent in terms of how we produce, firstly, and then move goods to markets. And that's really why we raised our hands and very keen to partner with the AU STC to host this event.
Tell me, where are we? South Africa had a road to rail master plan. Where are we now regarding to the implementation of that?
So, I can't speak with a great deal of authority, but I do know that Cabinet in the past month has approved the South African rail master plan. Part of that, of course, will deal with passenger rail, but a critical part of that will also deal with freight logistics on the rail corridors, and that also has been on the back end of that has been coordinated or synergized with the industrialization plan. So again, those corridors have to serve a purpose. We have to look at what industries we want to industrialize in, and we then have to think about what kind of freight infrastructure we require to move goods and services. So the Rail Master Plan begins to attend to those questions. And then, of course, that the Transport Department has gone out to tender for the first sets of freight lines, in terms of which we bring in partners to develop those lines and to operate those lines, but the state remains the owner of the assets that are being created.
It's quite a tricky one to say if you want to operate the lines and you're asking the private sector to bring its money and to operate. What kind of, is it incentives? What will draw them in to really lay it all out?
Look, I think that question the private sector will answer. But we know that the volumes of freight capacity that we would have to transport will make private investments in that sector rife, right? And of course, we've seen this happen in other parts of the world. Ultimately, the question is, how does the state design this in such a way that you do not outsource, if you like to use the word privatize, you do not privatize the freight logistics sector, much as you do not privatize the energy sector, because ultimately those are instruments at the disposal of the state to drive industrialization, to drive inclusive growth. But the acknowledgement we must make is that the state, the sovereign fiscal matrix, does not give the state the opportunity to be able to pump in capital at this point when the capital injections are required. So the tension that we must resolve is, how do we begin to draw down on this private capital in a way that enables us to develop and roll out the infrastructure, enjoy the benefit to the economy, grow the economy, and as the economy begins to grow, of course, more people, the more the economy grows, more people are within the tax net, government fiscal revenue begins to improve, and that cycle kicks in. So, if ideologically if you want to say ideally, would you want? No, perhaps. But I think we have to deal with the practicality of the situation we find the country in and the globe in many respects, and say we have to unlock our potential. We don't have the capital to do that. We need to bring in capacity to the boat, finance capacity, but also the technical skills are not always sitting with government. And we could bring in those capacity, undertake the investments, and allow the economy to grow inclusively, and then we all better off for that situation.
And is it the same approach you're using for energy with transmission lines, especially in the areas that the PEs cannot really plug in because there's no lines available?
No, absolutely. So one of the unfortunate things about our energy system, we have massive solar and wind capacity sitting, particularly in the Capes. And unfortunately, the way our power system developed over hundreds of years, over 100 years, is that the generation centers set inland, so predominantly in Mpumalanga, Limpopo, that's where the major generation assets are sitting. And so naturally, the transmission lines mirrored that pattern of geolocation. But with the now opportunity sitting on the coastal lines, on the coastal areas, we have to rethink about how we're now creating transmission capacity to generate the electricity and then to transport or evacuate, if you like, to centers of demand. And then to your point, and similar to the point I've just made about transport, we don't have, the transmission development plan sets out a 400 billion rand investment over 10 years. That's required to get the country's transmission network sufficient to be able to exploit our generation capacity. And if at the level of the fiscal ability to fund, we'll probably fund it over the next 30, 40 years. And that's why one of the innovations we introduced was this concept of a integrated ITP, Integrated Transport Projects Office, which essentially does very much along the lines that I've just explained on the rail side. We've identified a series of lines, 7 lines, total 1,164 kilometers of line. And we're now putting it out to the private sector to say, come and invest. We will pay you for this infrastructure. The tariff will pay for the infrastructure. But we're now opening up the economy, because what we're doing is to now create the ability for those generation projects to be able to evacuate against the transmission capacity.
And what's the appetite, since I believe you went on some kind of tender last year? Or?
So we had, because it was nascent work, it was really pioneering work that we've been doing as a country. Of course, the experiences in other parts of the world, Chile, Brazil, India, other parts of the world have done this. For us, it was important to understand the methodology and then to domesticate the solution. So it's one thing to say people have done it in the world. It's another thing whether that works in our context. So the first thing we did was to understand the contextual setting. What makes more sense in terms of country comparison? And we arrived at a set of competitors, and we then went to cabinet to say we want to pursue this integrated transmission projects office. We did an initial market sounding exercise just to understand how the market appetite will work. From that experience, we were clear that there is significant interest from the market. We then went and issued an RFI because, again, it was ordinarily would have gone straight to an RFP, but we thought because it's the first time we do it as a country, let's understand what the market will actually generate. We got response. On the basis of that, we're now working towards the RFP issuance, which is intended to happen towards the latter part of this year. Now, one of the critical things that we need to address in that equation is when the foreign investment or any investor comes into the country, they want to be given a measure of comfort that in the event of a default, their investment is not going to be lost. So what guarantee does the state put up to backstop these investments? And we've had critical conversations to say, can the state afford, on the order of magnitude of what we expected to invest, 400 billion rand on transmission, 2.2 trillion rands on generation capacity? Is there solvency on the South African balance sheet to carry a contingent liability risk in those orders of magnitude? And the simple answer is that that capacity is not there. We worked with the World Bank, the IFC, the National Treasury team. We put together a construct called the Credit Guarantee Vehicle. What the Credit Guarantee Vehicle is, it acts as a sovereign backstop. So essentially, in the most simplest of terms, it's an insurance scheme that we're putting together. So in the unlikely event the country defaults or the owner of the asset defaults, they will have recourse to the vehicle to make sure that the investments are not lost. So that work is continuing. There's other work that we're finalizing with the National Transmission Company of South Africa, but we should be getting going on the ITPs towards the end of the year. Moving out. And then, of course, the National Transmission Company, as you know, as part of the unbundling of Eskom, we had created 3 entities, so it's distribution, generation, transmission. There's a lot of work happening in the transmission space. Because the transmission is not just about building transmission infrastructure, they also act as a transmission systems operator. And the legislation that guides our work era directs that the transmission systems operator has to provide, amongst other things, it must provide for non-discriminatory access to the network. So in other words, to your point, when generators produce electricity, they must be given a fair opportunity to access the network and sell that energy. And for that matter, we needed to ring fence the NTCSA. The president announced in SONA that there's work we must do around the model for the TSO. That work is continuing. We're led by the presidency, the National Treasury, and we're part of that work. But then the NTCSA must address 2 fundamental questions. What is its model for delivering transmission infrastructure? So 1,164, I've given you 2 numbers, 14,000 kilometers of line that must be built. I'm saying to you 1,164 kilometers we're doing through an IP. So you can see that on this trajectory will not get to the 14,000. So we have to focus on the NTCSA and say, on its balance sheet, what is it going to deliver? And that work is happening with the NTCSA. It's a funding question. But for the country, it is fundamentally a capacity issue.
Sure.
We have not built on that scale transmission for many, many years.
It kind of concerns me. It sounds as if to me that you've got all of these processes happening at the same time. And yet you're expecting the unbundling and the new companies from Eskom will have the trust of the market to want to come through.
Yeah.
And it doesn't sound to me like there's a staggering, as you know, that one of the critiques of the governance of the state is that sometimes the coordination is really not there. And I don't know how do you approach that? Yes, you need all systems to go,
Yeah.
but we've done this before with the Medupi situation of having two biggest plants happening at the same time. How do you manage that?
Let me say it's the nature of the beast.
Sure.
Right? For over 100 years, we had a vertically integrated energy system. So we had one person, one entity, ESCOM, who produces, transmits, and distributes energy. At the time, for much of that 100 years, that system worked because it helped the country industrialize. But in the past 20 years, we got to the realization, and also on the back of experience globally, that a vertically integrated utility is no longer the best model. Right? We have to ask also critical questions in our own context. What does that mean? So we know that our country still has to industrialize significantly to drive growth in the right kind of direction. And for that to happen, you need energy security. You don't only need access to energy, you need affordable energy, both for industrial consumers, but for indigent consumers. But the reality is that the kind of investments, again, that you have to make in the energy sector does require you to bring on board capital. The fundamentals in the energy sector, which is why it is largely a regulated industry. Pricing is regulated. Operations are regulated by NERSA. And we've had to do in the past 4 years, since 2022, when the president announced the Energy Action Plan, we've had to do what really the country had 20 years of time to do. But we have to do it now because the rest of the continent is moving ahead. The rest of the globe is moving ahead. The economy continues to be constrained. Electricity continues to be a binding constraint to economic growth. Energy costs are continuing to go up the wrong side of the cost curve. Energy is becoming increasingly expensive. So we have to intervene. The state has to intervene. I think NECOM, the response to the Energy Action Plan, the energy crisis, gave us a good model for how we work more coherently as the state. So there are important lessons that we took out of NECOM. We now have a department that's leading this charge in terms of the energy sector. But we've taken important lessons out of the NECOM experience. What is that level of coordination that you need across government? How does the presidency continue to drive some of the interventions? How does the line functions push the kind of policy agenda that's required? And we're doing multiple things. I mean, I'll just talk to you about the ITP. We're publishing the energy pricing policy, which is going to be a major element of it. We've published the IRP. We're now firming up on the IRP in terms of positioning the IRP as an investment pipeline more than an energy planning instrument. And that's why I say it's in the nature of the beast that you're fixing this plane in flight. You don't have an opportunity to land, refuel, refix. You have to say we have to get to this destination. But if we land, we're not likely to get where we want to at the time that we need to. And so these things have to be juggled around. Is there risk? Absolutely. Are we managing that risk? To the best of our ability. And of course, as we incrementally build confidence in the energy sector, I think increasingly you're beginning to see partners in the sector, development banks, some of the industry associations coming and say, we also have capacity, we can assist you to move on some of these things. And that synergy is beginning to develop. And as a country, I think our biggest strength has been in our ability to come together as a people at our weakest points for different reasons. I think in the energy space, we're at that point. And I think the country is coming together in a very sensible and coherent way to say we need to get this thing done. Are there fundamental questions we must ask? Are we privatizing the energy sector? Absolutely not. Are we bringing in private capital? Yes. Does the state have a role to ensure that you don't have a runaway train on prices when the sector is reformed? Absolutely. And these things have to happen coherently, and they have to happen with the state driving the agenda of transformation. The minister coined, people often talk about an energy trilemma. The minister has introduced the notion of an energy quadrilemma. So the trilemma is referred to access, sustainability, and affordability. We say those three things by themselves don't give us a complete South African picture. If you're not using these investments to grow an economy, transform, not only grow, transform an economy, bring higher numbers of black industrialists into how we execute an energy program. We are not addressing the South African grievance, right? And so we say it's a quadrilemma because these three are important, but they have to be binded to the fourth element, which is how do we use now these investments to transform an economy, build black industrialists, build an economy that is inclusive, and domesticate the production of the inputs that must now go into how we expand on our energy infrastructure.
Yeah, I spoke to the investors at the Gauteng Investment Conference, and they were saying, look, we don't really have a funding problem, we have a capacity problem.
Yeah.
And then the question becomes, does your department have a research and development or an instrument of sorts that can help those projects to be bankable?
I think that's a very important dimension to the question, because you're absolutely correct. I mean, we've made that acknowledgement. We don't have the capacity, or at least to the extent that we require that capacity. There are two things we must address. One is project preparation. Are we risking projects? Kusile, Metupi, did we understand what we're getting into, right, up front, so that we mitigate the kind of problems we had to deal with downstream? So if we can't risk projects, it's going to be costly, because you're going to pick up risks in between. You're going to have to respond to that, and that inevitably means you have to put more money into solving the problem. The second is our capacity risk, right? And part of how we're addressing the capacity risk is to bring in external capacity, because the reality is that the state will not always require this capacity, and the state will not always afford the kind of capacity that is required to do this at scale. And how are we then building? And then the critical thing from an energy point of view is how are we developing our ability to plan for an energy future, and the point you're making around planning capacity. So within one of our entities, SANEDI, South African National Energy Institute, we've created, or we are creating, an energy center of excellence. What that is we are going to assemble a team of the most dynamic energy planners in the country. We're going to pay them the kind of salaries that we keep them in the public sector, and we're going to drive energy planning. So yes, we'll bring in other actors in the space, but what will be certain is that the state is driving the agenda of energy planning, and we build the capacity to do that. We're working with SANEDI, we're working with other partners across the globe. Other jurisdictions have been, have offered help. In some instances, we've taken up parts of that help, but we're now locating that capacity at SANEDI. And by the way, that includes some of the institutions of higher learning, both on the planning side, but also thinking about the skills for the energy sector of the future. So we're working with the Department of Higher Education and Training, some of the academic institutions, TVET colleges, to say, you need a range of skills, new skills, that you have to develop. Ordinarily, you would take 30 years to develop the skills. We don't have that 30 years. We need to develop those skills in 5 to 7 years. What programs are we beginning to build to exponentially grow our skills in the sector?
And are you utilizing your partners, whether it's your African Development Bank, which is such instruments, and also other BRICS partners in developing this capacity?
We are. I must say we've been sluggish to get go. We've now consolidated the coordination with the Department of Higher Education. SANEDI is leading that effort. Last week we had conversations with some of the institutions of higher learning to say, I mean, for instance, in the nuclear space, we have not built nuclear since 1984. The last unit at Cuba came online around 1984. So that's the last build program we had in nuclear. But we've maintained dominance in the nuclear space. But if you look at the demographic of people who are in the nuclear scientists, largely reflect an untransformed society. But we now have to say there are skills that we must use. But how do we now build up on this? These people have taken 40 years to get to where they are. How do you truncate that and build those skills, like I say, 5 to 7 years? So we're working with industry, we're working with the DFIs, development partners, we're working with international bodies in that space, in the case of nuclear in particular, with the International Atomic Energy Agency, to say how do we close this gap of nuclear is quite, in fact, our industrial capacity, we often undermine the kind of industrial capacity we have. We have a significant industrial capability as a country. The question is, how do we broaden this up in terms of participation, and how do we ensure that industrial capability does not benefit the few, but that you have a broad-based and inclusive industrialization strategy which enables other partners to participate. Some of what I'm saying to you is that we don't have all the answers, and we're working with all the partners to help us get to the most clinically efficient solution for the problems we're
facing. I suppose this is why you're hosting this this meeting. Absolutely. To get some of the answers. Absolutely. And some of the ideas. Absolutely. And what kind of outcome or success matrix are you using to say, we got at least 2 or 3 insights that are useful to our plans?
Yeah. So you make an important point around capability. And our real desire out of this session is not to get out of here with many papers. It's really to get out of here with a social compact as the continent, to say we've spent many years understanding what must be done. We now need to create the capacity and capability to get it done. Right? South Africa, we have expertise. The rest of the continent is endowed with different kinds of experiences and expertise, and we need to rally that together to get us to be able to, just to give an example, the Grand Inga presents opportunities to power the continent, to meet energy security needs for the next decades. There's major obstacles to Grand Inga, one of which is the transmission infrastructure. One of the problems there is that you have to cross multiple jurisdictions from the DRC right to the more southern Tapier. There are different regulatory environments. There are different, even just the language barrier. It's a very complicated environment. The continent has to find that golden thread. It says, here is an opportunity. We have to put everything else aside. We have to create an ease of path for us to be able to develop this infrastructure so that the people of this continent, 800 million Africans, don't have access to electricity. But we've got an asset that sits here that can not only light up those 800 people, but can light up the continent in terms of industrial development. Out of this conference, we have to leave with a consensus about what are the mechanics to get this thing done.
Yeah, I think we'll have to have another debate about those energy technology, especially Inga project out. One day, I wish I can meet the project manager and go through his diary for the last 5 years and find out exactly what has been happening, since we don't really have an instrument to monitor really that project. But I think it is a key project, really at the heart of the Agenda 2063. But Subesh, thank you for joining us on BRICS Africa Channel.
Yeah, good stuff. Thank you.